You know how when we were kids, we'd always get asked the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? So for me, my boyhood self's answer to that question was changing robot car. And I think I said it this way partly because I assumed that my parents weren't aware enough to know what Transformers were. And so I felt that I had to put it in terms that they would understand. Of course, they and all my brothers simply laughed out loud. And at that moment, I realized that my answer probably did the exact opposite of what I intended it to do. So rather, it made me look like the clueless one. Fast forward to many years later, when my son was still in preschool, they had this school event called Career Day, where they would come to school dressed in the clothes of the job or the profession that they wanted to be when they grew up. Naturally, most kids came in lab coats, police uniforms, and fireproof vests. Another came in a button-down t-shirt with a hard hat and a T-square. And probably just one or two came in dressed in, paint-stained clothes and aprons and a beret. And so, being who I was, I couldn't help but sit in that classroom and think, where were the writers? Because naturally, the majority of kids in that classroom all, quote-unquote, wanted to be some kind of medical professional. Which brings me to my interview with licensed physician and inspired cartoonist Dr. Carlo Jose San Juan. Perhaps the most striking thing about Doc Carlo's story is the heckling he received for even thinking about wanting to be a cartoonist. When asked about what his biggest struggle was throughout his journey as an artist, he said, "I'm not sure what my biggest struggle was, just that there were many challenges to overcome. The first hurdle I had to conquer was the fact that whenever I brought up pursuing cartooning as a career, nobody around me was giving me any encouragement to go for it. From my friends to my teachers in school, and even some members of my family, I would receive either criticism of my too Western art style or flat out discouragement due to the suboptimal financial compensation of the profession. Basically, I was told early on that I wasn't going to make it." So, given that quote, who among us has had something similar happen to us? I'm pretty sure we've all heard those magical words before. And how are you going to make money off of that? I'm pretty sure that when we look back at our lives as writers and artists, we'll be able to see Doc Carlos' story in all of us. In fact, one very popular comic book writer who I used to admire before he became caught in a huge scandal once talked about how the school guidance counselor flashed him a concerned look when he mentioned that he wanted to become a professional comic book writer. And here's the amazing thing about Doc Carlos' story though, is that despite all the discouragement around him, he still put some effort into pursuing his career as a cartoonist. The naysayers did not and could not deter him. In another quote from the interview, he says, "I was definitely discouraged enough not to pursue a career in cartooning, at least not as my primary profession. Nevertheless, I treated it as a hobby and continued to study the comics I loved to read, figuring out why they worked and why they had whatever effect they had on me. I guess it was because of the criticism that I had the drive to continually improve on what I was doing." End quote. So it reminds me of a story in Jeff Goins' book, Real Artists Don't Starve, about former Chicago Cubs player Adrian Cardenas, who at the peak of his career, he'd just acquired a signing bonus of about $1 million, but he decided to quit Major League Baseball and instead tell the story of his parents' escape and immigration from Cuba. So in the same way, John Grisham was first and foremost a lawyer before he went into full-time writing every single morning before he'd have to clock in at work. Similarly, Alan Bean, the lunar module pilot for Apollo 12 and the fourth man to walk on the moon, at one point decided to leave NASA and paint the moon based on his personal experience. And because he's the only artist to have ever set foot on the moon, his paintings are able to sell for tens of thousands of dollars a piece. So the main problem, really, is that we've been conditioned into thinking that we can only be one thing. But the reality proves humans to be far more complex, naturally, than single-celled organisms. The truth is that we become several things throughout our lives, and all these eventually contribute to our entire experience and life's work. We cannot and should not discount everything that's happened to us so far, from the terrible jobs and bosses to the harsh and irreversible decisions we've made in the past. Steve Jobs once talked about how, while he was still in college, he decided to take a calligraphy course. And in the end, this paid off for him because he learned the value of good typography and applied it to his development of the Mac. And so, when Doc Carlo arrived at a similar crossroads in his life, he went with med school. But looking back, he sometimes wonders why he even had to choose one over the other. So this is another quote he had from the interview where he says, "I wish I knew that it was possible to do all that I do early on. I was told by someone whose opinion I greatly respected at the time, many years ago, that there was no way to be both a doctor and a cartoonist. I had to choose one. And being past the proverbial point of no return in medical school back then, the choice was obvious. Eventually, I still gave it all a shot, and here we are. Still, sometimes I think, what if I started earlier? I might have even taken some classes on it." End quote. So trying to juggle two things at once naturally means that there will be a struggle for time, as Doc Carlo suggests. However, for him, it was all definitely worth it. And maybe right now you're at a similar crossroads, wondering whether you should choose one over the other. Whether you're about to graduate from high school and enter college, or you've been let go from your job or made redundant because AI can do your tasks faster and more efficiently. So, for so long, society has led us to believe that our entire reason for living was so that we could work at a job, get a steady paycheck, save until retirement, and only then do what we've always wanted. Who in the world decided that? And who granted them the authority to talk about how life is supposed to be lived? If you read through some of the research I did for my post on why gaming is not a waste of time, you'll get a glimpse of just how far we've fallen off the edges of what it means to be human. So in that article or post, I quote Confucius, who said, "The superior man is not a utensil." End quote. So man is not a machine. We're not supposed to be cogs in the wheel of the never-ending chase for empty consumerism. We're not supposed to be working full 8-hour shifts every single day. Pre-industrial workers were allowed to take siestas. They were allowed to take long morning walks, mid-morning breakfasts. And maybe this is where the idea of second breakfast came from. Pre-industrial workers didn't do overtime. When the second evening clock struck, all work ceased, regardless of whether the task they were working on was finished or not. And quite ironically, in the distant past, serfs and laborers had roughly 120 to 150 days off. That's 3 to 4 full months every single year, where they were not required to work. A full quarter or a full season of no work. Why? Well, because it was winter and the crops wouldn't grow anyway. But these days, we're forced to work through the winter, at least if you live in a country with 4 seasons. But that's especially true if you want to take advantage of the Christmas rush. So it becomes quite ridiculous to think that serfs and slaves had more time off than we do in our present age. So, where do we go from here? Now, in all honesty, Doc Carlo had the right idea in that there was no need to choose between being a doctor and creating his art. And I admire him for his courage and dedication to chase after his passion for writing and creating comics. Even though it would require him to put in the work and balance his time between these two things, it somehow worked out for him in the end. He has this other quote in the interview where he says, "Just that mental shift from treating my cartooning as a hobby to it being another profession made me think of what I do, particularly the business aspect, a lot more seriously. I valued my work a lot more. It also made me change how I presented myself and how I would interact with my comic colleagues. My work and efforts to improve as a cartoonist also gained more structure." End quote. So, we each have different roles we play throughout our lives, whether that's as a breadwinner, a father, a mother, a son or daughter, a friend. The important thing, as Doc Carlo suggests, is that those roles are especially clear in our minds. It's not enough to just be a hobbyist. Writers write, artists create. It's ultimately our actions that truly determine who we are at the moment. Not wishful thinking, not our someday speeches or declarations, and it's not the people around us, but the things we do on a day-to-day basis. So whatever it is you choose to do from here on out, whether it's just one thing or two, go do it with the full knowledge that it's okay to be more than just one thing, more than just your job or your current profession. And most of all, go and make good art, especially if you want to. Finally, go and read our interview with Dr. Carlo Jose San Juan.